The wind howled across the rocky cliffs of Mount Carmel, carrying with it the scent of rain, a smell that had been missing from Israel for 3 long years. The land was cracked and thirsty, the people weary and broken from drought. But atop that mountain stood a man whose faith had not wavered, Elijah, the prophet of the Most High God. His cloak whipped around him as he stood tall against the roaring storm of disbelief. Before him, the prophets of Baal lay defeated, their shouts silenced, their altar drenched in shame. The people, once divided in heart, had witnessed fire fall from heaven, a consuming flame that licked up the stones, the wood, the dust, and even the water in the trench. It was undeniable proof. "The Lord, He is God!" the people cried out, falling to their knees. Elijah lifted his face toward heaven, tears mixing with the dust on his cheeks. The fire had fallen, God had answered, yet deep inside the prophet's heart trembled with a strange mixture of triumph and exhaustion. He had stood against an empire, faced down a false religion, and carried the weight of divine truth alone. But the victory felt heavy, as if a storm still loomed beyond the horizon. When word reached Queen Jezebel, the wife of King Ahab, she was furious. Her prophets, her priests, had been slaughtered by this wild man of the desert. In her fury, she sent a message to Elijah. "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them." The words struck Elijah like a dagger. He had seen the heavens open, but now he saw the face of death staring at him through Jezebel's wrath. Fear gripped him, sudden and suffocating. Without waiting for God's instruction, he ran. Through the night he fled, past the hills, through the valleys, until he reached Beersheba, on the edge of Judah's wilderness. There he left his servant behind and went a day's journey deeper into the desert alone. Under the lonely shade of a broom tree, Elijah collapsed. His heart was shattered, his spirit drained. He whispered the words no prophet should ever speak. "It is enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my fathers." The mighty prophet who once called down fire now begged for death. The wilderness echoed with silence, and exhaustion pulled him into a deep sleep. But even there, in the place of despair, God did not abandon him. As Elijah slept, an angel touched him and said, "Arise and eat." Before him was a small cake baked on hot stones and a jar of water. The prophet ate and drank, then lay down again, too weary to move. The angel returned a second time and touched him gently. "Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you." Strengthened by that divine meal, Elijah walked 40 days and nights through barren lands, until he reached Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, the same place where Moses once met the Lord in fire and thunder. There Elijah found a cave and took shelter. His body was safe, but his soul was still wounded. The fire on Carmel had proven God's power, but not eased his loneliness. The voice that once commanded nations now whispered in self-doubt. Then the word of the Lord came to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The prophet poured out his heart. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty, but the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too." God listened in silence, then told him to stand on the mountain, for his presence was about to pass by. A great and powerful wind tore through the cliffs, shattering the rocks before Elijah. But the Lord was not in the wind. Then came an earthquake, shaking the ground beneath his feet. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, fierce, blazing, terrifying. Yet the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. It was in that quiet breath, that soft stillness, that Elijah felt the true presence of God. He wrapped his cloak over his face and stepped out to the cave's entrance, trembling. The same voice spoke again, calm and intimate. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" The question was not accusation, but compassion, a call to awaken his weary heart. Elijah repeated his grief, and God answered not with rebuke, but with purpose. He gave Elijah a new mission, to anoint kings and a prophet to follow after him, Elisha. The message was clear. Elijah's journey was not over. He was not finished. He was not alone. And God's plan was far from complete. So Elijah rose again, renewed by the still small voice of grace. His steps were steady now, not because fear was gone, but because faith had returned. The desert wind had softened into a whisper by the time Elijah left Mount Horeb. The prophet, though weary, walked with new purpose. The echo of God's voice still lingered in his heart, gentle, steady, life-giving. He had been reminded that he was not alone. God had 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed to Baal, and now the Lord had given him a task to find a man who would carry on the flame. Across the fertile lands of Abel Meholah, the sound of oxen plowing through the soil broke the quiet rhythm of the day. A young man worked the field, guiding 12 yoke of oxen through the furrows. His name was Elisha, son of Shaphat. His hands were rough, his shoulders strong, but his heart was soft, the kind that could hear God's call even through the noise of ordinary life. Elijah watched him for a while from a distance. He saw in this young man not power or pride, but obedience, the rare kind that would drop everything for God. Without a word, Elijah walked forward, his heavy cloak dragging dust behind him. As he passed by Elisha, he removed his prophet's mantle, the very symbol of God's authority, and cast it across the young man's shoulders. The act was brief, but it spoke louder than any command. It was a call, a transfer, a whisper of destiny. Elisha froze. The oxen kept moving, but his heart stopped. He looked at the man walking away. This wild prophet whose name every household whispered with awe and fear. He knew in that moment his life had changed. Elisha left the oxen and ran after Elijah. "Please," he said breathlessly, "let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, then I will follow you." Elijah turned, eyes soft beneath his furrowed brow. "Go back," he said, "for what have I done to you?" The words were not of rejection, but of freedom. The call was not forced. It had to be chosen. So Elisha returned home, but not to stay. He took the wooden yoke from his oxen, broke it apart, and used it to cook the meat of the animals, offering it to the people as a farewell feast. It was a symbolic act, burning the bridge to his past, leaving no path back to the life he once knew. Then Elisha rose and followed Elijah, becoming his servant, his student, and eventually his successor. Days turned into weeks and weeks into years. Together they traveled through towns and deserts, calling Israel back to repentance. Elisha watched Elijah in awe, his courage, his intimacy with God, his loneliness, and his fire. But he also saw his humanity, the weariness in his eyes, the quiet sighs when no one was listening. Elijah had lived his life between mountains and storms, fire and whispers. Yet as his final days drew near, there was a stillness in him, a peace that comes only from knowing one's mission is complete. One morning, as the dawn stretched its first light across the hills, Elijah turned to Elisha. "The Lord has sent me to Gilgal," he said quietly. "Stay here." But Elisha shook his head. "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they journeyed together. At Bethel, Elijah repeated the same words. "Stay here, Elisha." But again, Elisha refused. There was something in his spirit that knew this was no ordinary day. When they reached Jericho, the sons of the prophets came out to meet them. Their faces were solemn. One of them whispered to Elisha, "Do you know that today the Lord will take your master from you?" "I know," Elisha said softly. "Be silent." Elijah's gaze met his once more. "Stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." Elisha's reply was steady. "As surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went on, two figures walking side by side, the elder and the apprentice, their shadows stretching across the land like a fading story written by God himself. When they reached the banks of the Jordan River, 50 prophets stood at a distance to watch. Elijah took his cloak, rolled it tightly, and struck the waters. The river parted, and the two of them walked across on dry ground, just as Moses and Joshua had done before them. When they crossed, Elijah turned to Elisha, his eyes soft but firm. "Tell me, what shall I do for you before I am taken from you?" Elisha took a breath, his voice trembling. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Elijah smiled faintly. "You have asked a hard thing. Yet if you see me when I am taken from you, it shall be so." They walked on together, speaking quietly of heaven's mysteries and God's faithfulness. Then suddenly, the air shifted. The ground trembled beneath them, and the sky seemed to open. A chariot of fire drawn by horses of fire appeared between them. The light was blinding, fierce, and holy. Elijah's cloak fluttered wildly as the whirlwind lifted him upward. His body carried heavenward in a blaze of divine glory. "My father! My father!" Elisha cried out, falling to his knees. "The chariot of Israel and its horsemen!" And just as quickly as it began, the whirlwind faded. Silence returned, but Elijah was gone. Only the mantle remained, fluttering down through the air, landing softly beside Elisha. He picked it up, trembling. His mentor was gone, but his spirit lived on. Elisha turned back toward the Jordan, rolled up the cloak as Elijah had done, and struck the waters. "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" he cried, and the waters parted once again. The same God who called fire from heaven and whispered in the wind now walked with a new prophet. Elijah's journey had ended in a whirlwind of glory, but his legacy lived on, not in fire or storm, but in faith passed from one heart to another.
The wind over the Jordan quieted, leaving behind only the sound of rippling water. The cloak of Elijah, that simple strip of camel hair, now rested on Elisha's shoulders, heavy with both memory and divine calling. The river still shimmered with the echo of miracle, and in that moment, Elisha knew that the story had not ended. It had only changed hands. He stood there for a while, staring at the horizon where his master had vanished. The sky was calm again, but Elisha's heart burned with the same fire that once fell from heaven. Only this time, it was a quieter flame. Steady and enduring, he turned and walked back across the Jordan. 50 prophets who had watched from a distance saw him approach. When they noticed the water had parted for him, as it had for Elijah, they bowed their heads. "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha," they said in awe. Elisha did not answer. His eyes were still misted with tears, but his steps were sure. Every gust of wind that brushed his face felt like a whisper from his old mentor. "Walk on. The work continues." As he journeyed back into Israel, memories of Elijah's life filled his mind. The thunder on Mount Carmel, the desperate prayer for rain, the whisper on Mount Horeb, and the fire that carried him home. Elijah had lived in storms and silences alike, showing that the God who sends fire is also the God who speaks gently to the broken heart. The people of Israel would tell stories about Elijah for generations. To some, he was the prophet of fire, the man who called down heaven's flame and silenced false gods. To others, he was the lonely wanderer who faced fear, doubt, and hunger, yet still obeyed God's voice. But in truth, Elijah was both fire and frailty, courage and fear, power and weakness. And through him, God revealed that his strength is made perfect in our weakness. Elisha carried that lesson deeply within him. He would go on to perform miracles, purifying poisoned waters, multiplying oil for a widow, raising the dead, and healing the sick. But he never forgot where it all began. With a weary man under a broom tree, whom God refused to abandon. Years later, when people spoke of Elijah, they would look to the sky, remembering that he never saw death, that he was taken in a whirlwind of glory. But the greater truth was this: Elijah's life was not defined by how it ended, but by how he walked with God even when the fire went out. In the heavens, beyond mortal sight, the chariot that carried Elijah still burns with divine light, not as a memory of power, but as a promise that those who walk faithfully, even in weakness, they will one day rise beyond their pain, lifted by the same hand that once whispered in the wind. And so the story of Elijah, the prophet of fire and frailty, became a living reminder that God's voice is not always found in thunder or earthquake or flame, but in the still, small whisper that speaks to the heart. When the fire fades and the noise is gone, remember God still speaks in whispers. He's not just the God of the mountaintop victories. He's the God of your silent valleys too. If you've ever felt like Elijah, tired, forgotten, or afraid, lift your eyes. The same God who found Elijah under the broom tree still finds you where you are. Don't give up now. Your story isn't over, it's only changing hands. If this story reminded you of God's faithfulness, type, "Lord, speak to me in the whisper," in the comments below. Share this video with someone who needs to know that God still speaks, even in silence. And if you haven't yet, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next powerful story of hope and redemption.